The welding sparks fell like snow. Outside, the 88mm shells were punching holes through apartment walls. Inside the tractor factory, Professor Nikolai Kozlov was bolting gun barrels to chassis with whoever hadn't fled the city. Students, professors, janitors. It didn't matter anymore. The war had dissolved every distinction that peacetime invented. The tank rolled off the assembly line. No paint, no sights, just raw steel and fury. How do we aim this thing? The driver was maybe 19. Kozlov shrugged. Look through the bore. Point where you want the shell to go. The boy climbed in, drove it straight through the factory doors, into the street, into the war. This was Stalingrad. September 1942. The place where the Wehrmacht learned that tanks could be built by professors and aimed by prayer. Where every rule of modern warfare went to die in the rubble. Where an army that had conquered most of Europe walked into a city and discovered that everything they knew about how wars worked was written by men who'd never seen desperate people with nothing left to lose. The Germans had crossed the Don, taken most of the city. They thought it was over, just mopping up. Standard procedure, air support, artillery, panzers, infantry. The same formula that had worked in Poland, France, North Africa, half of Russia. They were wrong. The 16th Panzer Division rolled toward the industrial district with the confidence of professionals. These men had broken through the Maginot Line. They had driven to the suburbs of Moscow. They had earned their arrogance in a dozen countries. Now they were assigned to clear the northern sector of a city that was already mostly rubble. Sergeant Nina Vishnevskaya crouched behind the 85mm gun. The barrel was designed for aircraft, high-altitude bombers, Stukas diving at steep angles, anti-aircraft work. The gun had never been built to engage armor at ground level. Today it was hunting tigers. Range, 400 meters. Her loader was Katya, 19 years old. 2 weeks of anti-aircraft training. No tank warfare doctrine. No experience with armor engagements. Just a young woman who understood which end of the shell went into the breach and how quickly she needed to move. The Panzer IV rounded the corner, commander's hatch open, confident. Why wouldn't he be? This was an elite division. Professionals. They'd rolled through half the world. Vishnevskaya pulled the trigger. The high-velocity shell punched through the turret face, clean. The tank lurched, stopped. Smoke poured from every opening. Next target, she said. The 1077th Anti-Aircraft Regiment had 27 guns, all crewed by women, support staff, radio operators, mechanics, clerks. None of them were supposed to be tank killers. None of them had been trained for this moment. They had been assigned to protect the city from aircraft, and now aircraft were the least of Stalingrad's problems. The Germans came again, 8 tanks this time, cautious, advancing by bounds, using cover. Textbook armor tactics developed over years of doctrine and experience. Vishnevskaya's gun spoke. The lead panzer died. The second tank tried to reverse, too late. Katya had already loaded the next shell. 6 hours, 28 German tanks destroyed. No infantry support, no armor backup. Just women with anti-aircraft guns turned horizontal, defending a city that the Wehrmacht had already marked as captured on their maps. Major Heinrich Sachs climbed out of his burning Tiger. 3rd tank this week. His crew was dead. He'd started the campaign with 47 tanks. Now he had 12. Most killed by weapons that shouldn't exist in this role. Crews that shouldn't fight. Women who by every rule of military doctrine should have been nowhere near a forward combat zone. He radioed division. We need immediate support. The enemy is employing anti-aircraft assets in ground roles. Understood. Enemy strength? Sachs looked back at the burning metal, at The women visible in the gun positions. At the bodies of his men scattered across the approach route. Unknown. They're not supposed to be here. But they were, and the Wehrmacht was learning that their assumptions about who could fight and how and with what had been written in peacetime. By men planning for a war with rules. Stalingrad had no rules. Stalingrad had only the question of who could survive long enough to matter. General Vasily Chuikov had studied German tactics carefully before he took command of the 62nd Army. He understood their doctrine, he understood their strengths, and he understood exactly how to neutralize both. He gave his commanders a simple rule: get close, stay close. Make the Germans choose between killing his men and killing themselves. 50 meters, he told them. Never let them get further than 50 meters from our positions. The confusion this created in German command was immediate and catastrophic. Colonel Friedrich von Zeckendorf read the intelligence report twice. The Russians were violating every principle of modern warfare. They weren't establishing proper defensive lines, no clean fields of fire, no organized interlocking positions with defined sectors of responsibility. They were hugging. Sir, the Luftwaffe is requesting target coordinates. Zeckendorf stared at the map. Red pins marked Soviet positions. They were everywhere, mixed in with German units, overlapping, intertwined, a nightmare of proximity that made air support a weapon pointed at both sides equally. Tell them to bomb grid square 347. Sir, that's where our own panzers are operating. I know. This was the problem. German doctrine required distance to function. Air support needed clear targets. Artillery required defined enemy positions with clean boundaries. Combined arms meant coordination between different weapon systems, and coordination required separation. You could not call artillery on a position that was also your own position. But you cannot coordinate when the enemy is in your lap. The German attack sequence had been perfected over 3 years of war. Stukas first, screaming down at steep angles, high explosives and incendiaries. Then the 105mm howitzers, precise, methodical, a 20-minute barrage that shattered whatever the aircraft had missed. Then the tanks advancing in formation, main guns suppressing strong points, machine guns dealing with exposed infantry. Finally, the grenadiers moving through to clean up, consolidate, and advance to the next objective. At Stalingrad, the sequence was suicide. The Soviets learned to read the pattern. When the Stukas dove, they disappeared into basements. When the artillery lifted, they emerged. When the panzers advanced, they were waiting with anti-tank rifles and Molotov cocktails at point-blank range. By the time the German infantry arrived to clean up, the tanks were burning and the Soviet defenders had repositioned into the rubble to do it all again. Captain Franz Weber watched his 4th Tiger die in 2 days. The hull was intact. The crew was dead. A direct hit from an anti-tank gun at 30 meters, a distance that should have been impossible to achieve without being spotted and eliminated first. How did they get so close? His radio operator asked. Weber pointed at the rubble, at the sewers, at the cellars, at the 1,000 hiding places in a city that had been methodically destroyed to create exactly this kind of cover. They live here. We're just visiting. The Wehrmacht had trained for maneuver warfare, open terrain, clear sight lines, coordinated advances where each element supported the others, and the whole was greater than the sum of its parts. Stalingrad was none of those things. It was chaos. It was madness. It was a place where doctrine arrived and desperation consumed it, leaving nothing behind but rubble and bodies. In this environment, individual acts took on a weight they would never have carried in conventional battle. Marine Mikhail Panikeka crawled through the debris field toward a Panzer IV that sat 30 meters away, engine idling, commander scanning the ruins through his periscope. The Molotov cocktail was heavy in his hand. Gasoline and tar, a strip of cloth for a wick. The simplest weapon imaginable against the most sophisticated killing machine the Wehrmacht had produced. He lit the wick, stood up, drew back his arm. The machine gunner saw him. The MG-42 chattered, 600 rounds per minute. The bottle exploded in Panikaka's hand. The gasoline ignited, covered him from head to toe. He was a human torch, already dead. The laws of physics had already written the end of his story. Any rational accounting of cause and effect said he was finished. Panikake reached for the second bottle. Inside the tank, Unteroffizier Hans Kruger watched the burning figure stagger forward, watched him light the second Molotov, watched him leap onto the engine deck. The explosion shook the 30-ton machine. Fuel and fire poured through the air intakes into the engine compartment. The Maybach V-12 died. Kruger and his crew bailed out. The tank was finished. In his after-action report, he wrote, "Enemy personnel displayed suicidal tendencies inconsistent with rational tactical doctrine. But rational had left Stalingrad weeks ago. What remained was will, pure, distilled, unbreakable." The Wehrmacht kept trying to understand the Soviet defenders in military terms, kept writing reports about their tactics and doctrine and psychological state, and kept missing the fundamental truth. These were not soldiers following a doctrine. These were people who had decided that the price of failure was too high to contemplate. When that decision is made completely enough, the body becomes an instrument of a will that no longer concerns itself with survival. The SS newspaper tried to explain it to the German people. The Bolsheviks attacked until total exhaustion. Sometimes the individual fought beyond the point considered humanly possible. They were right, but they missed the point. At Stalingrad, humanly possible was a luxury nobody could afford. The mathematics of Pavlov's house illustrated this principle in the starkest possible terms. Sergeant Yakov Pavlov had 32 soldiers, 1 4-story apartment building, 2 months to hold it, against the 6th Army. The mathematics were insane, but mathematics hadn't built this fortress. Desperation had. And desperation proved to be a more effective architect than any military engineer. Each room became a bunker, each window a firing port, each stairwell a killing ground. The basement held ammunition. The first floor belonged to machine guns with interlocking fields of fire through blown-out walls. The second floor was sniper positions with long sight lines across the square. The third floor was Pavlov's command post with clear view of German approach routes. The fourth floor was observation and mortar spotting. The building had been converted from a place where people lived to a place where people killed. Every German attack funneled through doorways, up staircases, into rooms where defenders waited with submachine guns and grenades, fighting with the intimate knowledge of people who understood every dimension of the space, every angle, every shadow. Hauptmann Klaus Dietrich had studied the fortress through binoculars for 6 weeks. 4 stories, maybe 40, defenders. His regiment had 800 men and artillery support. The first time he looked at those numbers, he gave it an hour. That was 6 weeks ago. "Sir, the morning attack was repulsed. We took the first floor but couldn't hold it. Casualties are 47 killed, 93 wounded." Dietrich did the arithmetic. In 2 months, his regiment had suffered more casualties attacking one building than they'd taken conquering entire villages in France. The building had become a black hole. Men went in. They didn't come out. General Chuikov visited the fortress in October. He walked through rooms where German blood stained the walls, where bullet holes formed constellations of violence. "How many Germans have you killed?" he asked Pavlov. "We stopped counting after 300, Comrade General." Later, in his memoirs, Chuikov would write that this group killed more Germans than were lost taking Paris. The claim was probably exaggerated, but not by as much as it should have been. The Wehrmacht had trained for mobile warfare, for breakthrough and exploitation, for fluid engagements where speed and firepower decided outcomes. They were not equipped for siege warfare, for grinding, room-by-room combat where every meter cost blood, and the defender's advantage compounded with each passing day. Pavlov's house held until the German surrender. 32 men against an army. 4 stories against a doctrine. Architecture had become destiny. Beneath the city, a different war was being fought. Obergefreiter Wolfgang Schneider descended into the basement. The air was thick with sewage and cordite and death. This wasn't warfare anymore. This was something the German language had developed a specific word for, because the experience was specific enough to demand its own name: Rattenkrieg, rat war. The sewers stretched beneath Stalingrad like arteries, and the Soviets used them for everything: movement, resupply, surprise attacks. They could emerge behind German positions like ghosts, kill, disappear. The underground was its own country, with its own rules and its own geography, and the Soviets had claimed it completely. Schneider's squad was hunting ghosts. The tunnel branched left and right into darkness. His flashlight beam caught movement. Maybe a shadow. Maybe the last thing he'd ever see. Major Anatoly Soldatov moved through the sewage like it was his natural environment. The filth came up to his chest. Human waste mixed with industrial chemicals mixed with the blood of 2 armies. It was, as he would write later, unbelievably filthy. The kind of filth that redefines the concept. The kind that peacetime cannot prepare you for. But filth was camouflage. The German soldiers above were clean, professional. They thought like soldiers. Soldatov thought like a rat. And in a rat war, the rat wins. He emerged through a storm drain behind German positions. 3 sentries. Backs turned. They were watching for attacks from the front, because attacks came from the front. That was doctrine. That was logic. The knife was silent, efficient. The sentries died without sound. Soldatov planted the charges. Timed fuses. 10 minutes. Enough time to disappear back into the tunnels before the explosions brought the building down on the German command post inside. Flamethrowers were useless in sewers. Gas dissipated in running water. The tunnels were immune to conventional weapons because conventional weapons had been developed for conventional warfare, and the sewers of Stalingrad were not a conventional battlefield. They were a maze in the dark, where the side that was willing to live in filth held every advantage. Lieutenant Werner Hauser wrote to his wife, "We are fighting people who are not people anymore. They live like animals, fight like demons. I do not know what they have become." What they had become was necessary. The surface belonged to the Wehrmacht. The underground belonged to the defenders. And the defenders had made themselves into creatures of the underground, shedding whatever comfort or dignity that identity required, becoming something that doctrine could not account for, and training could not defeat. The night belonged to the same principle. The darkness came at 1800 hours like clockwork, and with it came the fear that the Wehrmacht had never experienced before Stalingrad. These were soldiers who had fought in darkness before. Night operations were part of their training. But they had always owned the night. They had always been the hunters. At Stalingrad, the night belonged to someone else. Obergefreiter Klaus Weber checked his watch. 21:30 hours. 3.5 hours until dawn. 3.5 hours of listening to every sound, every creak, every whisper of wind through rubble, that might be the wind or might be the last sound he heard. "Movement, 2 o'clock," his machine gunner whispered. Weber strained his eyes, saw nothing. But something was out there, something patient, something that understood exactly what it was doing. The MG-42 opened up, 600 rounds per minute. Tracers carved bright lines through the darkness, illuminated nothing. When the gun fell silent, the darkness rushed back and everything was exactly as it had been. Chwikov had noticed this pattern weeks earlier. "German forward posts are panicky at night," he wrote, blazing away with machine guns and flares at any sound. He recognized it not as weakness, but as opportunity, and he exploited it with the precision of a scientist. Senior Lieutenant Alexei Gorshkov crawled through no man's land, 30 meters from German positions. He could hear them breathing, whispering. He picked up a brick, threw it into a bombed-out building 200 meters away. The crash brought immediate response: machine gun fire, rifle shots, flares. The Germans lit up the night and revealed their positions and wasted their ammunition, exactly as Gorshkov had predicted they would. He marked the locations on his map, tomorrow's mortar targets. The psychological engineering was deliberate and calculated. Weber's squad fired 400 rounds that night and hit nothing. The next morning they found footprints in the dust 30 meters from their position. Someone had been watching them for hours, counting them, learning their routines, mapping their positions for future use. "The bastards are playing games with us," Weber told his sergeant. But it wasn't games, it was the systematic destruction of professional soldiers' confidence in their own capabilities, the science of breaking trained killers down to their animal instincts, of making men who had conquered Europe afraid of the dark. The Wehrmacht had owned the night in Poland, France, North Africa. At Stalingrad, the night belonged to ghosts, and ghosts didn't play by rules that armies had written. The weaponization of the city itself was the final innovation that the German tactical mind could not fully process. Tank commander Heinrich Müller watched his panzer IV disappear into the earth, bucket by bucket, shovel by shovel. The Soviets were burying it alive, not destroying it, converting it. The T-34 hull settled into its excavated position, turret traversing, main gun covering the approach. The tracks were gone. The engine was silent. 30 tons of steel had become a permanent fixture, a bunker that could kill but could never move, never retreat, never be anything other than exactly what it was at that moment. This violated every principle of armored warfare. Tanks were mobile, flexible. They used speed and maneuver to survive. A stationary tank was a target. A stationary tank was a mistake, unless it was defended by a city of rubble that made approach impossible, unless it was positioned to cover an approach route with no alternative, unless the side deploying it had decided that mobility was less valuable than permanence, and that the mission was not to advance, but to kill. Müller studied the battlefield through binoculars and counted 17 buried positions, all stationary, all covering different sectors, all impossible to flank because the rubble on every side was equally impassable. The German assault came at dawn. 12 Panzer IVs in formation, standard doctrine for engaging enemy armor. The buried T-34s waited, let them close. 50 meters, 40, 30. The slaughter began, high-velocity shells at point-blank range. German tanks caught in a killing field, with nowhere to run because they had advanced into a carefully constructed trap, because their doctrine said advance, and the Soviets had constructed the terrain to punish advancement. Müller's tank took 2 hits. What remained was inventory, bodies, thousands of them. A German soldier crouched over a cesspool, frozen solid. His face, Wirth recorded, reflected suffering and something that looked like incomprehension. Around him lay yellow corpses like wax dummies, stripped of the quality that made them identifiable as former human beings by the cold and the starvation and the time that had passed since they stopped being either. The basement had been a command bunker, 60 meters underground, steam heat, electric lights, everything needed for modern warfare except one thing: hope. General Friedrich Paulus had coordinated the defense of a dying army from this concrete tomb, received Hitler's orders through crackling radios, sent situation reports to a leadership that had already written off the Sixth Army as an acceptable sacrifice for propaganda purposes, a force that could pin Soviet units in place while the rest of the front stabilized, regardless of what that cost the men doing the pinning. The temperature outside had reached -40 Celsius. Soldiers burned furniture, ate horses, ate leather, ate what was available, and then ate what was not, and then stopped needing to eat at all. Wirth found a German officer's diary. The last entry read, "The whole war for France was shorter than the fight for one Volga factory." The factory still stood, broken, gutted, but standing. The Wehrmacht had arrived with 270,000 men, modern weapons, air support, artillery, all the instruments of a military machine that had reshaped the map of Europe. They had possessed every material advantage that 3 years of victorious war could provide. They had understood the wrong things. They thought they were fighting an army. They were fighting a city, a people, a decision that had been made collectively and individually by every person still standing in Stalingrad, the decision that this was the place, that there was no further back to go, that the price of failure was too large to pay and too specific to ignore. You cannot defeat that with doctrine. You cannot outmaneuver it with tactics. You cannot bomb it or shell it or outflank it. You can only meet it and discover whether your own commitment is equivalent, and the Wehrmacht discovered in Stalingrad that theirs was not, because theirs was the commitment of professionals doing a job, and the Soviets were people defending something that had no replacement. Professor Kozlov's improvised tanks had done their work. The women of the 1077th had held their guns. Panikeka had lit his second bottle. Pavlov's 32 men had consumed a regiment. Soldatov had moved through the sewage like it was water. Gorshkov had watched from 30 meters and marked positions in the dark. The buried T-34s had created killing fields from immobility. Dadov had made the mathematics of retreat equal to the mathematics of advance. All of it together had eaten an army. The city had taught the world a truth that the textbooks of professional warfare had systematically failed to record. Victory did not belong to the best trained, the best equipped, the best led. Victory, when the stakes were high enough, and the defenders had stripped away everything that peacetime calls essential, belonged to the most committed, to those willing to pay any price, cross any line, abandon any principle, become whatever the moment required them to become. The Wehrmacht had come to Stalingrad with doctrine perfected over years of victories against opponents who played by recognizable rules. The Soviets had responded with something that rules cannot account for and training cannot produce and doctrine cannot defeat. They had responded with the decision that survival required transformation, and that transformation had no ceiling. The yellow corpses were frozen in time, testimonies to what happens when one side brings everything it knows, and the other side becomes something that knowledge cannot contain. Stalingrad had been the laboratory. The lesson was written in 6 months of fighting that consumed both armies and left one standing. It was written in improvised tanks and buried armor and women behind anti-aircraft guns, and men burning alive who reached for a second bottle. It was written in the sewers and the dark and the basements and the 4 stories of an apartment building that became the most expensive piece of real estate in the history of warfare. It was written in the simple, terrible truth that desperation, organized and directed and given no alternative, is stronger than doctrine, that, when everything is at stake, everything becomes possible, even survival, even victory, even the impossible. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more World War II historical deep dives every week. Thanks for watching.